Emily sat at her desk, nervously tapping her pencil against her notebook. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder than usual as she waited for her home teacher to arrive. Her parents had dropped the news just yesterday. They needed to leave town for her grandmother's unexpected surgery, and Emily would be alone in the house for at least a week. "We've already spoken with Daniel," her mother had explained while packing her suitcase. "He's agreed to continue your tutoring sessions while we're gone." Emily had nodded, trying to hide the flutter in her stomach at the thought of being alone with Daniel. At 25, he was only a few years older than her 20-year-old self, and with his warm brown eyes and gentle smile, she had developed a small crush on him over the past month of tutoring. The doorbell rang, pulling Emily from her thoughts. She smoothed down her simple blue sweater and tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear before heading to answer the door. Daniel stood on the porch, his messenger bag slung over his shoulder. His usually neat hair was slightly tousled from the autumn wind, and he offered a friendly smile that made Emily's heart skip. "Hi, Emily. Ready for today's session?" he asked, stepping inside when she moved aside. "I think so," she replied, leading him to the dining room table where she had spread out her books. "My parents left this morning." Daniel nodded, setting down his bag. "They called me yesterday. How are you feeling about being on your own?" "I'm 20, not 12, Emily said with a small laugh, though she appreciated his concern. "I'll be fine." As Daniel unpacked his teaching materials, Emily couldn't help but notice how different the house felt without her parents' presence. The air seemed charged with a new energy as Daniel sat down beside her, closer than he normally would with her parents hovering nearby. "Let's start with calculus today," he suggested, opening her textbook. "You mentioned having trouble with integrals last time." Emily nodded, trying to focus on the numbers and symbols before her rather than the subtle scent of Daniel's cologne. When he leaned closer to point at a problem, his arm brushed against hers, sending a small shiver up her spine. "Sorry," he murmured, shifting slightly away. "It's okay," she replied quickly, maybe too quickly. The first hour passed with Emily struggling to concentrate. Daniel's voice, explaining mathematical concepts, seemed deeper and more intimate in the quiet house. When their fingers touched as they both reached for the same pencil, Emily felt her cheeks grow warm. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked suddenly, needing a moment away from the table. "Water? Coffee? Tea? Tea would be nice," Daniel replied with a smile. "Need help?" No, I've got it," Emily insisted, hurrying to the kitchen. While waiting for the kettle to boil, she took deep breaths, trying to calm her racing heart. This was ridiculous. Daniel was her teacher, here to help her with her studies, nothing more. When she returned with 2 steaming mugs, she found Daniel looking at family photos on the wall. "Is this you?" he asked, pointing to a picture of a younger Emily in a ballet costume. She nodded, setting down the mugs. "From my short-lived dancing career." "I was terrible." Daniel laughed, a warm sound that filled the quiet house. "Somehow I doubt that." Their eyes met for a moment too long before Emily looked away, returning to the table. "We should probably continue with the lesson." As the afternoon wore on, the initial awkwardness began to fade. Emily found herself relaxing, even laughing at Daniel's terrible math jokes. When he explained a particularly difficult concept, his face lit up with passion for teaching, and Emily found herself watching his animated expressions rather than looking at the textbook. The sun began to set, casting golden light through the windows. Neither of them had noticed the time passing until Daniel glanced at his watch. "It's getting late," he said, sounding surprised. "We've been at this for nearly 3 hours. "Oh," Emily replied, feeling oddly disappointed that their time was ending. "I guess we have." As Daniel packed up his things, he paused. "Will you be okay for dinner? I mean, with your parents gone." "I was just going to make a sandwich or something," Emily admitted. Daniel hesitated, then said, "I could stay a bit longer. Help you make something proper to eat." Emily smiled, a warm feeling spreading through her chest. "I'd like that." As they moved to the kitchen together, Emily realized that the week ahead might be very different from what she had expected. And somehow she wasn't nervous anymore. She was excited. The kitchen filled with the soft sounds of chopping and sizzling as Emily and Daniel worked side by side preparing dinner. Emily was surprised at how comfortable it felt, this new domestic scene between them. Daniel had rolled up his sleeves, revealing tanned forearms as he diced vegetables for the pasta they had decided to make together. I didn't know teachers could cook, Emily teased, stirring the sauce on the stove. Daniel laughed, the sound warming the space between them. There's a lot you don't know about me, he replied with a hint of mystery in his voice. Their hands brushed as they both reached for the salt, and this time neither pulled away quickly. The brief touch sent a small electric current up Emily's arm. After dinner, they returned to her studies, but the mood had shifted. The initial awkwardness had melted away, replaced by an easy companionship that made Emily's heart beat a little faster whenever Daniel leaned close to explain a concept. The trick with these problems, Daniel was saying, his shoulder pressed lightly against hers as they hunched over her textbook, is to break them down into smaller steps. Emily nodded, but she was distracted by the way his dark hair fell across his forehead when he bent forward. She had an unexpected urge to reach out and brush it back. Suddenly, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Power outage, Daniel said, stating the obvious. His voice sounded different in the dark, deeper somehow. I'll get some candles, Emily replied, fumbling in the blackness. She felt Daniel's hand catch her wrist, steadying her. Careful, he said softly. Let me help. Do you have a flashlight? In the kitchen drawer, she answered, acutely aware of his hand still on her arm. Together they made their way to the kitchen, bumping into each other and laughing when Emily stubbed her toe on a chair leg. The simple act of navigating the dark house together felt strangely intimate. They found candles and matches, and soon the dining room table was bathed in a golden glow. The flickering light cast shadows across Daniel's face, highlighting his cheekbones and the curve of his lips as he smiled at her across the table. This is kind of nice, Emily admitted, settling back into her chair. Like studying in another century. Very romantic, Daniel said, then quickly added, I mean, atmospheric. For studying. Emily looked down at her book, hiding a smile. The candlelight made studying feel less like work and more like a secret adventure they were sharing. Maybe we should take a break, Daniel suggested after a while. It's hard to see the small print. Emily agreed, closing her book with relief. Would you like some tea? The stove is gas, so we can still boil water. As they sat with steaming mugs, the conversation drifted away from academics. Daniel told her about growing up in a small coastal town, his dream of writing a novel someday, and how teaching was supposed to be temporary but had captured his heart. What about you? He asked, his eyes reflecting the candlelight. What does Emily dream about when she's not solving calculus problems? No one had asked her that in a long time. Emily found herself opening up, sharing her hopes of traveling, her secret love of photography, and her struggle to decide on a career path that felt truly right. Sometimes I feel like I'm just going through the motions, she confessed, doing what everyone expects. Daniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. Finding your own path is the hardest part. The power came back on suddenly, harsh electric light breaking the spell of their candlelit conversation. They both blinked, looking almost disappointed. I should probably go, Daniel said, checking his watch. It's getting late. As Emily walked him to the door, a new awareness hummed between them. This was different from their earlier sessions when her parents had been home, hovering nearby or interrupting with offers of snacks. Same time tomorrow? Daniel asked, pausing in the doorway. Yes, Emily replied, perhaps too quickly. I mean, if that works for you. He smiled, a gentle expression that made her stomach flutter. I'm looking forward to it. After he left, Emily leaned against the closed door, hugging herself and smiling. The house felt emptier without him, but filled with possibility. Tomorrow seemed full of promise, bright and shimmering on the horizon. For the first time, she was grateful for her parents' absence and the space it had created for something new to grow between her and Daniel. Emily woke up earlier than usual the next morning, a flutter of excitement in her stomach. She spent extra time choosing her outfit, settling on a simple blue dress that her friends once told her brought out the color of her eyes. She caught herself humming while arranging her books at the dining table, and smiled at her own eagerness. When the doorbell rang at exactly 2:00, Emily had to stop herself from rushing to answer it. Daniel stood on the porch, his hair neatly combed today, holding a small brown paper bag. I brought cookies, he said with a smile, holding up the bag. Homemade. I thought we might need brain food for our session today. Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest at this small, thoughtful gesture. You bake too? Is there anything you can't do? Daniel laughed as he followed her inside. Many things. You should see me try to dance. As they settled at the table, Emily noticed Daniel had brought something else as well, a book of poetry. He caught her looking at it and seemed almost embarrassed. I remembered you mentioning you liked poetry yesterday, he explained. I thought some of these might interest you. Emily picked up the book, touched by his attention to what she had shared. Thank you, that's really thoughtful. Their study session began as usual, but there was an ease between them now, a comfortable rhythm as they worked through problems together. When Emily correctly solved a particularly difficult equation, Daniel's face lit up with pride. See? I knew you could do it, he said, his hand briefly touching her shoulder. The warmth of his touch lingered even after he moved away. During their break, they shared the cookies and Daniel read her a poem from the book he'd brought, his voice taking on a gentle cadence that made the words flow like music. Emily watched his lips as he read, the way his eyes softened at certain phrases. What do you think? He asked when he finished. It's beautiful, she said softly, though she'd been paying more attention to him than to the words. As the afternoon wore on, their conversation wandered from academics to music they loved, books that had changed them, places they hoped to visit someday. Daniel described a trip to the mountains he'd taken last summer, his eyes bright with memory. You should see it at sunrise, he said. The whole world looks new. I'd like that, Emily replied, allowing herself to briefly imagine being there with him, watching the dawn break over distant peaks. When Daniel's phone buzzed with a message, he checked it and frowned slightly. Everything okay? Emily asked. Just a reminder about a meeting tomorrow, he said, putting the phone away. Nothing important, but something had shifted in his expression, a shadow passing behind his eyes. Emily wondered what he wasn't telling her, but didn't feel she could ask. Instead, she got up to make tea, and when she returned, Daniel was looking at her family's record collection in the corner of the living room. You like vinyl? She asked, setting down the mugs. My dad collected these, Daniel replied, carefully flipping through the albums. He pulled one out with a smile of recognition. This was one of his favorites. Emily took the record from him, an old jazz album, and placed it on the turntable. The warm, crackling sound filled the room, and Daniel's face softened with delight. May I? He asked, holding out his hand. Before she realized what was happening, Emily was dancing with Daniel in her parents' living room, his hand light on her waist, their bodies keeping a respectful distance even as the music seemed to draw them closer. He moved with unexpected grace, guiding her in a gentle sway. I thought you said you couldn't dance, she teased, breathless more from his nearness than from the movement. I said you should see me try, he corrected with a grin. I never said I was terrible. The song ended too soon, and they stood for a moment, still holding hands, neither wanting to be the first to let go. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, turning Daniel's brown eyes to amber, highlighting the slight stubble on his jaw. Finally, reluctantly, they returned to their studies, but something had changed between them. Their chairs were closer now, their glances holding longer, their laughter coming easier. When their hands touched over a shared book, neither pulled away quickly. As evening approached and Daniel prepared to leave, Emily found herself wishing for ways to make him stay. The house would feel empty without him now, the silence heavier. Same time tomorrow? She asked, echoing his words from the night before. I'll be here, he promised, his smile carrying a warmth that stayed with her long after he had gone. The next few days settled into a pattern that Emily found herself eagerly anticipating. Daniel would arrive each afternoon, arms often filled with books and occasionally bearing small surprises, a pastry from the bakery near his apartment, a fascinating article he thought she'd enjoy, once even a small potted plant that looked like it needed a home. Their study sessions grew longer, neither seeming in a hurry to end their time together. Today, Daniel had brought his laptop to show Emily a documentary related to her literature assignment, and they sat side by side on the living room couch, the computer balanced between their knees. This is my favorite part coming up, Daniel said, leaning closer to the screen. Emily nodded, though she was more aware of Daniel's shoulder pressed against hers, the clean scent of his cologne, than she was of the documentary. When he turned to gauge her reaction to a particularly moving scene, their faces were unexpectedly close. Emily's breath caught in her throat as his eyes briefly dropped to her lips before returning to her eyes. The moment stretched between them, electric and fragile, before Daniel cleared his throat and shifted slightly away, returning his attention to the screen. Later, as they worked through her chemistry problems at the dining table, Emily found it increasingly difficult to concentrate. Daniel's hand brushed against hers as he reached for a pencil, and this time Mather pulled away. His fingers rested lightly against hers for a moment too long to be accidental. "Emily," he said softly, her name sounding different somehow in his voice. She looked up, meeting his gaze. "Yes." Daniel seemed to be struggling with what to say next. "I think we need to talk about this." "This," she echoed, her heart pounding. "Whatever is happening between us," he clarified, gesturing to their still touching hands. Emily felt a flush creep up her neck. Part of her wanted to pretend she didn't understand, to preserve the safe bubble they had created. But another part, a braver part, made her say, "I like you, Daniel. More than I probably should." The words hung in the air between them. Daniel's expression softened, relief and something warmer mixing in his eyes. "I like you too," he admitted, "and that's complicated." "Because you're my teacher," Emily said, understanding. Daniel nodded, finally withdrawing his hand from hers. "I have responsibilities, professional boundaries." "It's just tutoring," Emily countered, immediately wishing she sounded less desperate. "It's not like you're my professor or something." "Even so," Daniel said, running a hand through his hair, "there are expectations. Your parents trusted me to help you with your studies, not to." He trailed off, leaving the unspoken possibilities hanging between them. Emily looked down at her textbook, the formulas and equations now just meaningless symbols. "So what do we do?" "The responsible thing would be to maintain our professional relationship," Daniel said, though his tone suggested he wasn't convinced by his own words. "Is that what you want?" Emily asked, daring to look up at him again. Daniel held her gaze for a long moment. "No," he finally admitted. "But what I want isn't always what's right." The honesty of his answer, the conflict evident in his expression, made Emily's heart ache. She reached for his hand again, a deliberate choice this time. "Maybe we don't have to decide everything right now," she suggested. "Maybe we just see where things go, but set some boundaries." Daniel looked at their joined hands, his thumb gently brushing over her knuckles. "What kind of boundaries did you have in mind?" "We focus on my studies during our sessions," Emily proposed. "No distractions, but maybe we don't have to pretend we don't feel anything." Daniel considered this, his expression thoughtful. "That seems fair," he agreed finally. "Though I'm not sure how easy it will be." Their eyes met again, and the air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Daniel's gaze dropped to her lips again, and for a moment Emily thought he might lean in. Instead, he gently squeezed her hand once before releasing it. "We should get back to work," he said, his voice slightly rougher than before. "You have a test next week." Emily nodded, trying to focus on the textbook again, but the space between them now felt charged with a new awareness, a current of possibility that made even the simple act of studying together feel intimate and full of promise. When Daniel finally left that evening, their goodbye at the door lingered, neither willing to end the moment. No lines had been crossed, but something had shifted irrevocably between them. A door opened that could never truly be closed again. The weekend arrived with unexpected speed, bringing with it a strange mix of anticipation and tension. Emily spent the morning cleaning the house and trying not to check the clock every few minutes. Daniel had offered to come earlier today, suggesting they could cover more material if they started after lunch. When the doorbell rang at 1 o'clock, Emily's heart leaped. She opened the door to find Daniel standing there, looking different somehow. He wore jeans and a casual blue button-down shirt instead of his usual more formal attire. The change made him appear younger, less like her tutor and more like someone else entirely. "I brought lunch," he said, holding up a paper bag. "I thought we might be hungry while we study." They set up their impromptu picnic on the living room floor, spreading out sandwiches and fruit on a blanket Emily found in the linen closet. As they ate, Daniel seemed quieter than usual, his thoughts elsewhere. "Is everything okay?" Emily finally asked when the silence had stretched too long. Daniel looked up, meeting her eyes with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I got a call this morning," he said slowly, "from the university. Emily waited, a sense of foreboding creeping into her chest. They've offered me a teaching position, he continued. It's a great opportunity, something I've been hoping for. That's wonderful, Emily said automatically, though her heart had begun to sink. Congratulations. It starts in 3 weeks, Daniel added, watching her carefully. Which means, you won't be my tutor anymore, Emily finished for him. Understanding dawning, she looked down at her half-eaten sandwich, no longer hungry. I'll still finish out our scheduled sessions, Daniel assured her. Help you prepare for your final exams, but after that. The words hung between them, heavy with implications. After that, things would change. Whatever had been growing between them would have to be redefined, or perhaps ended before it truly began. I'm happy for you, Emily said, meaning it despite the ache in her chest. This is what you wanted. Daniel nodded, but his eyes remained troubled. It's what I wanted, he agreed. But things are different now. The simple admission sent a flutter through Emily's stomach. Different how? She asked, needing to hear him say it. Daniel set down his food and shifted closer to her on the blanket. You know how, he said softly. Their eyes met, and the tension that had been building between them for days seemed to crystallize in that moment. Daniel reached out, his fingers lightly touching her cheek, tracing a path that left her skin tingling. I've tried to be professional, he said, his voice low, to remember why I'm here. And why are you here? Emily asked, barely above a whisper. To teach you, he replied, but his eyes said something different. Is that all? She pressed, bolder now. Daniel's hand lingered on her face, his thumb brushing her lower lip in a touch so gentle it might have been imagined. No, he admitted. Not anymore. Emily leaned into his touch, her heart racing. They were so close now she could feel his breath, see the different shades of brown in his eyes. The moment stretched between them, taut with possibility. The shrill ring of her phone shattered the moment. Emily jerked back, startled, and Daniel withdrew his hand quickly, as if burned. The phone continued to ring insistently. You should get that, Daniel said, his voice rough. It could be your parents. Emily reached for her phone with shaking hands. Sure enough, her mother's number flashed on the screen. She answered, trying to sound normal despite her racing heart. Hi, Mom, she said, watching as Daniel moved away, gathering their lunch things with deliberate focus. Her mother's voice came through, asking about the house, her studies, whether she was eating properly. Emily answered automatically, her mind still on the moment that had just slipped away. We'll be gone a bit longer than expected, her mother was saying. Grandma needs more time to recover. Is that okay? Will you be all right on your own? Emily's eyes met Daniel's across the room. I'll be fine, she said. Don't worry about me. After she hung up, a new silence fell between them, charged with unfinished business. Daniel stood near the window, his posture tense. My parents are staying away longer, Emily said finally. My grandmother needs more time to recover. Daniel nodded, still not looking at her. We should probably get back to your studies, he said, gesturing toward the textbooks they had abandoned. Daniel, Emily said, standing up. What just happened? Was a mistake, he finished, turning to face her at last. But his eyes betrayed him, darkened with feelings he couldn't hide. Or it would have been. Would it? She challenged, taking a step toward him. The air outside was cool and crisp, with autumn leaves swirling across the sidewalk as Emily nervously checked her appearance one last time in the hall mirror. She had spent nearly an hour deciding what to wear, finally settling on a burgundy dress that she'd bought last year, but never found the courage to wear. Tonight felt different. Tonight wasn't a study session. 3 days had passed since their almost kiss, days filled with careful distance and professional focus that felt more like a performance than reality. But with each passing hour, the tension between them had grown, their glances lingering longer, their accidental touches sending electricity through Emily's veins. Yesterday, after closing her calculus textbook, Daniel had paused before gathering his things. Your parents are still away, he'd said, a statement rather than a question. Emily had nodded, waiting. Would you like to go out tomorrow? For dinner, maybe? He'd asked, his voice carefully neutral though his eyes betrayed his nervousness. Not as your tutor, just as me. Now, as the doorbell rang, Emily took a deep breath and opened the door. Daniel stood there in dark jeans and a charcoal sweater, holding a small bunch of wildflowers. These reminded me of you, he said, handing them to her. Beautiful but not cultivated, natural. Emily took the flowers, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. Thank you. Come in while I put these in water. As she filled a vase, she felt Daniel watching her, the weight of his gaze making her movements self-conscious. When she turned around, he was closer than she expected. You look beautiful, he said simply. Emily blushed, looking down. So do you. I mean, not beautiful. Handsome. Daniel laughed softly, the sound easing some of the tension. Ready to go. The restaurant he had chosen was small and intimate, tucked away on a side street with warm lighting and tables, set far enough apart for privacy. As they settled in, Emily noticed how different Daniel looked outside the context of her home, more relaxed and somehow more himself. This is strange, she admitted as they studied their menus. Seeing you somewhere else. Good strange or bad strange? Daniel asked, his eyes meeting hers over the candle flame between them. Good, Emily replied without hesitation. Definitely good. The conversation flowed easily over dinner, moving beyond the careful boundaries they had maintained during their study sessions. Daniel told her about his family, his younger sister who was traveling in Europe, his parents who had divorced when he was 12. Emily shared stories of her childhood dreams, her complex relationship with her well-meaning but overprotective parents, her fear of settling for a life that didn't excite her. That's why teaching appealed to me, Daniel said, twirling pasta on his fork. Every day is different. Every student brings something new. Is that why you applied for the university position? Emily asked. Daniel's expression grew thoughtful. Partly. It's a good opportunity. But, Emily prompted when he didn't continue. But lately I've been questioning whether it's what I really want, he admitted, or if I'm just following the path I thought I should take. Their eyes met, and Emily felt the implication of his words. The waiter appeared with dessert, breaking the moment, but the connection between them had deepened, shifting into something more honest. After dinner, they walked through a nearby park, the paths lit by old-fashioned lamps that cast pools of golden light. When Emily shivered slightly in the cool evening air, Daniel shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth of it enveloped her, carrying his scent. Thank you for tonight, Emily said as they paused by a small fountain, for seeing me as more than just your student. Daniel turned to face her, his expression serious in the dim light. I've seen you as more than that from the beginning, he confessed. I just couldn't admit it. Emily felt her heart racing as he stepped closer, his hand gently touching her cheek as it had days before. This time, there was no phone to interrupt them, no hesitation in his eyes. May I? He whispered, his gaze dropping to her lips. Emily nodded, unable to speak. The first touch of his lips against hers was gentle, questioning. She responded by stepping closer, her hands finding their way to the shoulders. Daniel's arms circled her waist, pulling her against him as the kiss deepened, becoming something hungry and honest. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that for so long, he murmured. Me too, Emily admitted, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. As they walked back to her house, hands intertwined, the future hung between them, uncertain but full of possibility. For tonight, that was enough. Emily stood at the front door, watching her parents unload their luggage from the taxi. After 2 weeks of unexpected freedom, their return brought a mixture of emotions. Love and comfort, but also a small sense of loss. The house would no longer be just hers and Daniel's private world. Emily. Her mother called, rushing forward to embrace her. You look different. Did you change your hair? Emily smiled, accepting her father's hug as well. No, Mom. Everything's the same. But that wasn't quite true. Everything had changed in ways invisible to her parents' eyes. The dining table where they now set down their bags was where she and Daniel had spent countless hours studying, their hands occasionally brushing. The couch in the living room had witnessed their first real conversation, heads bent close together over poetry. How did your studies go with Daniel? Her father asked, carrying bags toward the bedroom. Did you make good progress? Yes, Emily replied simply, helping her mother unpack groceries they had picked up on the way home. My final exams are next week. What she didn't say was how the past week had transformed her relationship with Daniel. After their first kiss in the park, They had carefully balanced their time between genuine studying and stolen moments of closeness. Daniel had remained dedicated to her education, insisting she be fully prepared for her tests. But their evenings had been filled with conversations that stretched until midnight, walks under star-filled skies, and kisses that grew increasingly difficult to end. That evening, Daniel arrived for their final scheduled tutoring session. Her parents greeted him warmly, thanking him for continuing while they were away. If they noticed the way Daniel's eyes lingered on Emily, or how her cheeks flushed when their hands accidentally touched while passing books, they said nothing. "We'll be in the kitchen if you need anything," her mother said, leaving them to work at the dining table. The session felt strangely formal with her parents in the house, a return to the professional distance they had maintained before. Yet underneath the careful facade, each glance carried the weight of their shared secret. "I think you're ready," Daniel said finally, closing the last textbook. "You've mastered everything we've covered." "Thanks to you," Emily replied softly. Daniel gathered his materials, packing them neatly into his bag. "Your parents mentioned they'd like to speak with me before I leave." Emily nodded, a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. "Probably just to thank you again." In the kitchen, her parents offered Daniel coffee and began discussing payment for the extra sessions. Emily stood by the doorway, watching Daniel's polite interaction with them, seeing how he kept his responses professional while occasionally catching her eye. "Actually," Daniel said during a pause in the conversation, "I wanted to let you know that I've accepted a teaching position at Westfield University. I start next week." "That's wonderful news," Emily's father said, shaking his hand. "Congratulations. It means I won't be available for tutoring anymore," Daniel continued, his voice steady. "But Emily has made excellent progress. I'm confident she'll do very well on her exams." After final thank yous and goodbyes, Emily walked Daniel to the door, conscious of her parents' presence just rooms away. "This feels strange," she whispered as they paused at the entrance, pretending. Daniel's eyes softened. "Not for much longer," he promised quietly. "Call me after your exam on Thursday." Emily nodded, resisting the urge to touch him. "Good luck with your first day at the university." "Good luck with your exams," he replied with a smile that held so much more than professional encouragement. The following week passed in a blur of studying and test-taking. Emily threw herself into preparation, channeling all her nervous energy into making sure she would make Daniel proud. When she walked out of her final exam on Thursday afternoon, a sense of lightness filled her chest. It was over, both her exams and the chapter of her life where Daniel had been only her teacher. She called him from the steps of the exam hall. "How did it go?" he asked immediately. "Really well," she replied, unable to keep the smile from her voice. "I think I aced it." "I never doubted you would," Daniel said warmly. "Are you free tomorrow evening? There's a faculty reception at the university, and I'd like you to be my guest." Emily paused, understanding the significance. "Won't people ask questions?" "You're not my student anymore," Daniel replied simply. "You never were officially. And I'm not hiding how I feel about you." The next evening, Emily stood beside Daniel in a crowded reception hall, his hand occasionally resting at the small of her back as he introduced her to his new colleagues. There were curious glances, but Daniel met them with a calm openness that left no room for judgment. Later, as they walked through the campus gardens under a canopy of early stars, Daniel pulled her close. "No more textbooks between us," he murmured against her hair. "No more boundaries," Emily agreed, tilting her face up to his. As their lips met, Emily knew that what had begun as an unexpected chance, being left alone with her home teacher, had become the beginning of something real, something that would continue long after her parents' absence had faded into memory.